Welcome everyone to another Blender tutorial. Today we're going to be making the flower orb effect that I've recently posted to my Instagram page. It's mostly made up from geometry nodes, but the lighting is made with some texturing and a couple of area lights. So really, fundamentally, it's quite straightforward. Let's jump right into it. So we're going to start with a new scene, go into the geometry nodes workspace. I do have my screencast keys enabled on the left, so if you need to know anything, then look there or throw something in the comments and I'll be sure to get back to you. Start by deleting the default cube and opening up a fresh new one, adding a new geometry nodes modifier to it. We're not going to use the cube, so we're going to delete the input and add in instead a mesh circle and attaching that into there. This circle is currently made up of 32 vertices, but we only going to need 8 of them. Now on each of these vertices, we're going to instance on those points. So we go instances, instance, not 2 points, instance on points. Grab out the instance point and type in UV sphere. Obviously these are quite big for the moment and don't quite have the same effect as we were looking for, and that's because we are going to be deleting quite a bit of this geometry. Take this out and use a separate geometry node. Obviously we don't want to separate all of this. We are going to do it by faces. So instead what we're going to do is take the selection and we're going to separate only on the Z component. So we're going to need to separate X, Y, Z on the Z. This has obviously gotten rid of everything, but if we take this vector, you can see that things are changing. The vector we're going to use is the position. What this position is, it goes from -1 all the way up to 1. So here is where it's 0, so everything under 0 is going into this Boolean point that is being separated and not being shown to us. Instead, what we want to do, we want to remove some from the top and some from the bottom. We want to take a utilities math node and we want to take everything that is greater than. So what you can see this has done is that this has given us a threshold where we can take away geometry from the bottom, but we also want to take away some from the top. So we take this, duplicate it, and we change this to a less than. So if we combine these with another math node, when we get the correct values on this, we will be able to remove some of the geometry. I found the best values for this for what I used was in the less than we did minus 0.35 and in the greater than I used 0.35. So we get just a section out from the middle. Tell a lie, that was the wrong way around. So it's negative in the greater than and positive in the less than. As you can see, this isn't working, and that is because this is a math node. So what we actually need is to add a utilities Boolean math node. Get rid of this with Control X, plug both of these in, and now we have the selection that we're looking for. So that where the magic happens, if you look from top view, you can see we already have this spiral pattern that's looking beautiful. From here, I'm going to take an asset that I've created. This is based off of the Matthews Solidify tutorial on YouTube. Great channel, definitely encourage you to go check that out. I've saved this into my asset browser, so which I highly encourage everyone to utilize. It's a great way of not having to repeat yourself every time you want some assets. In here I've got geometry nodes, shortcuts and effects, and I have created this solidify node, which I can simply drag and drop into my workspace and use at any time. So I'm going to take this and drop it into here. Obviously that's solidified way too much. I only needed it solidified by 35 millimeters. Yours might be different. I have changed my world settings in here to be units millimeters, but that's just a personal preference. Offset 0, and we're just going to keep all these settings as they are. Again, for further information on this, I highly encourage you to go check out Johnny Matthews' tutorial on YouTube. So now we have this basic setup. What we need to do now is add the second element to the object. So I'll do a quick bit of tidying up. And I'll put these into a frame so we can keep this all nice and organized. So we want to do a similar thing here for the second element. We're going to take another mesh circle, so I can just duplicate this, Alt P to take it out the frame. Instead, what I'm going to instance on this is another mesh circle. So I can just duplicate this and add that into there. Once again, I am going to solidify this to create that disk shape. But first, if I plug this into here, then I can see what I'm instancing. This has 8 points, which is good. That's all I need. If I solidify this, we can get that same effect. But this time, I want these mesh circles to be filled in. Bring that over here, solidify those. If we look from the side, you can see that thickness there. So I'll take this, and of course we want a lot more geometry on these instant circles. So I'll put this up to 64. So when we go into wireframe, you can see here that those circles are on those points. If we go into solid view, you can see that they're not looking all that interesting, and that's because they've kind of all merged into each other. So what we'll do is we need to rotate these instances. In order to do that, we need to just take a rotate instances points. In order to do this, we need to take the attribute from this initial mesh circle so that we can use the parameters of that and rotate along that axis. Hopefully this will become clear as I go through it. We need to capture the attribute. So attribute, capture attribute, and we want to capture the attribute of this initial mesh circle. What we need to grab is the normal. So we take the input normal.
Quick interjection, I just wanted to explain what I'm doing with this capture attribute and why we're doing it. So I've set up a simplified version of our scene here. We have our circles instanced on our other circle. We want to rotate these about the center. You could quite simply think, okay, we have our rotate instances, we can rotate them on the X and on the Y. But what you'll notice if we fill these in is that these are in fact rotating all along the global axis. So if I set this back to 0, look down the X, and we are rotating them all along the same axis. Whereas what we want to do is we want to rotate them in relation to the middle point here. The reason we're using this mesh circle is because if we look at just the mesh circle, each of these points has a normal. To explain about the normal, you have to understand that a circle, or really any point, has two parameters to it. It has the normal, which comes out this way, and it has the tangent, which carries on and it follows the curvature. So if we put this up to 100, then this point here, the tangent will be in this direction here. So if we put this back to 8, we do want to rotate the circle. So this, if we imagine that this circle is here, and we want to rotate it along this x-axis. So if we rotate this here like this and go back to here, you can see that this circle does in fact rotate the way we want it to. However, we want to offset that rotation for the next circle in the chain so that it rotates along its local x-axis, which will follow along here. So these blue lines are the rotational axes about which we want to rotate. And as you can see, this indicated by the purple pip is a vector. So we change this from float to vector and plug that into there. Now what we can do is we can plug this straight into the rotation. And as you can see, that is affecting each of our instant circles individually, which is great. However, this is affecting our circles a little bit too much and it's not quite the effect we want. So we're just going to take a vector math node, plug it into there, Alt P, because we don't want that in that frame. And we're just simply going to scale it, which is the same as multiplying each part of the vector by the same number. So instead of 1, we're just going to bring this down until we have something that we like the look of. In order to really show this off, I'm going to plug our original geometry into here with a join geometry node. Right there you can see the effect is really coming together. To make this look even better, what I did is I had twice as many of the disks, which I will frame here with Control J, F2 to rename, and name this disks. I ensured that there were twice as many disks as there were spheres. What I really like to do is I like to take a group input node, and we don't need the original geometry, but we can take any of these parameters in here and add them into our modifier stack on the right hand side. So
Predominantly what we want is the vertices from our mesh circle. So now we can control how many of the spheres we have, and we can use that same number on our mesh circle down here. Obviously nothing's changed because they're both 8. We want to have twice as many disks as we do spheres. So if I take a utilities math node and multiply by 2, now we have, for each of the spheres, we have 2 disks inside there. And we can put this up to 3 if we wanted, or as many as we like. However, I'm going to stick with 2. If you want, you could even make this a new parameter on the outside, though I'd highly recommend you change this to an integer, and that way you don't need to deal with the decimals. Once again, I'm just going to take some time to tidy this up. There's a lot more we can control. We can transform the disks and spheres on the z-axis. We can rotate them. We can move them about however you want. But I think at that point, that's more of an artistic standpoint. And I highly encourage you to go and take a look and move the geometry around however you think looks best and see what you can come up with. But from here, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to beautify this a little bit. So we're going to go mesh, set shade smooth. I'm going to set a material for each of these. Now I did use a different material for each of them. So in order to do that, you just go to material, set material, shift D and replace that. We need to create 2 new materials on the right hand side. So name this spheres and a new one here and name this disks. You can select them from here, spheres, disks. So if we go into shaded mode, what we can do is we can see that we've just got a white object at the moment and we want those nice neon colors. So I'm going to delete the default lamp and I'm going to Shift A, add in 2 area lights. So grab that on the Z, Shift D, right click to reset that. I'm going to take the first one, rotate it about the 3D cursor, using full stop for that shortcut, and whatever that is, so that's 25 degrees, I'm going to rotate this one by the same but on the negative, so minus 25 degrees. If I can scale both of those up along their individual origins, we now need to up the power on both of those. A neat trick here is that if we hold the Alt key while increasing this, it will affect both of them at the same time. If we weren't to do that, it would only affect the active object, which is indicated by the yellowy orange here. In order to get the nice effect and the nice vibrant colors, I did put this all the way up to 2000 watts. Again, if you hold Alt and Enter, that will affect both of them at the same time. It might look a bit blown out right now, but maybe that's just because I need to take them and I just need to grab them up on the Z, a local axis, so that isn't quite so intense. But again, this is all dependent on how you have your scene set up. So with those lights, we obviously want them to be slightly different. So we'll have one going into the pink and one going into the blue there. If we look from top view, you can see we already have quite a nice gradient effect. However, what I did find was that the pink was slightly overpowering, so I did bump that one up to 3000 watts. Now that we've got a simple lighting set up, we can go into the shading tab, click on here, and I've already got set up my disks and spheres. So we'll do our disks first, go into rendered mode so we can see our lights. Start off with a simple texture coordinate node and plug the object coordinates into the base color. What's quite nice about this is we have a really nice rainbow effect. But we want to control that. In order to do so, we'll use a converter color ramp. I'm going to take the left hand side and turn that into our pink, and the right hand side and turn that into our blue. So to really make this effect pop, we want to really increase the contrast. So we're going to take an input ambient occlusion node, ensuring that in our render settings over on the right hand side, especially if we're in EV, we want to turn on ambient occlusion and of course bloom to get that nice pop. So we can take this color, run it through another color ramp, and if we plug that into the base color, we can see that not very much has happened, and that's because we need to click inside personal preference
and clamp up that so you can really see that darkening come into effect on the outside there. To combine these two effects, we're going to use a mix RGB and multiply them using the ambient occlusion as a factor. The factor is going to be multiplying by a darker color so we can get some darker colors on the outside and some lighter colors on the inside. Though in order to bring that lightness back into the image, we can take another mix RGB, so Shift D, and adding that once again using the ambient occlusion as a factor and brightening this up again. Play around with it, just see what settings work for you. I'm sure you'll be able to come up with something fantastic. I then didn't change too much in the principal BSDF, but I did decide that it looked quite good if they were metallic and increase the roughness just slightly. This looks quite good on its own, however I will throw some little secrets in here. I don't know what I'm doing half the time, and a lot of it is just playing around with what looks good. From here we have the very basic effect we need, but we can improve this ever so slightly by just playing around with these texture coordinates. First of all, the easiest thing to do is to take the object coordinates and use that for the normal in the ambient occlusion node. And that's just brightened it up in the middle. It's a very subtle effect, but it does add just a little something. Another thing I started playing around with was changing the object coordinates by taking a mapping node. And from here, we can separate the vector by using a separate XYZ node. I found that there was a really cool effect if we can have the ambient occlusion affect the object coordinates here. So we're going to use a vector math node, and I'm going to set this to multiply add. Again, there's no real magic to this. I was just playing around to see what looked good. I took the X and I used that as the vector. I used the Y and used it as the multiplier and added the color into the add end. So what happens when we plug this into the color ramp is we get this ever so slightly subtle effect, but it does add just a little something. It won't be adding too much because most of the effect does come from our lighting anyway. What we can do now is we can take all of this, Control C, go into a spheres material and Control V. So we can delete that principal BSDF and plug this into here. We don't want it to be exactly the same because it wouldn't be too interesting. So what I did was I took this, I did reduce the roughness ever so slightly. Just noticed a mistake. This here should be add. We wanted to add this. And on the spheres, this is darker than the multiply here. So if we go back to our disks, change this to add, it's just a slightly different effect. So now I'm sure you're wondering how I animated the effect. So for that, we need to go back into our geometry nodes. And again, this was mostly just playing around. There's no real science behind it. It's just taking what we already have, adjusting parameters, using the timeline, and seeing what looks good. So for this, it was a 450 frame animation, though of course you can make it as long and short as you want. The easiest way I find to animate things in geometry nodes is to bring out the parameters you want into this sidebar over here. So once again, using the group input, we can take what we want here, and I really like it when you can just have something set from 0 to 1, so it's as a percentage. So whatever rotation, location you need, instead of trying to dial in really neatly those points, you can do that within geometry nodes, but then you can animate it using simple 0 to 1. And that really tidies up your timeline, your graph editor, and any fine tweaks you want to make later on. So what we were doing was we were rotating the disks, and in order to do that, we take our rotate instances node, and if you recall, this is the factor by which that they rotate along their axis. So that's the key value that we want to be animating. So if we take a utilities map range node, we plug that into our scale. Before we do that, we need to note that we set this as 0.2. And to me, that looks like quite a nice base level of rotation. So we want our 0 to go from 0.2. Then we can plug that in. We can bring our input into this value, which we can set at 0 to begin with.
That's reset everything. And now what we can do is we can set this to 1, and this will be the maximum rotation that we have on our disks. So I can bring this down to roughly 0.8. So we don't quite want it all the way around, but that's just a nice number. Again, this is the artistic point where you can do what you decide looks best. So from there, we just start on keyframe 1, press I on our value when it's set to 0, go to the end of our timeline, set this to 1, press I again. And when we press play, you can see that that's animating really slowly because that's much too big a range. So instead, what we want to do is we want to take this keyframe, grab it, and let's just set it at 120. Now you can see that rotation happening. However, you might be able to notice that that starts off slowly, speeds up in the middle, and comes back down slowly again. That's not the effect we want. Instead, we want to hit the T key in our timeline, set that to linear, so that it all goes at the same speed all the time. Just to show the effect better, I'm going to bring that keyframe down here, and now you can see that rotation happening. So duplicate these just to get the effect. Now you can see that that oscillates between the open phase and the closed phase. Again, nothing too complicated. Then another small effect you can do is simply rotate this on the Z axis. So we can bring out our location here, set on frame 0, the rotation, I, go to the middle, set the Z to 360, press I again, go to the end again, and add 360, press I, and now the whole thing is going to rotate. Again, ensuring that we hit A to select all our keyframes, T and linear, and that did affect it, so that's just going to look a lot nicer as the animation goes through. And that's the basics of the effect. I hope that was easy enough to follow. Again, as I've mentioned all the way through, to make this really pop and make it how you want it to look is all comes down to the parameters that you affect and just playing around with the values a little bit. I hope this is of good value to you, and if you have any questions, put them down in the comments, like the video, and let me know what you want to see next. Subscribe to see that, and I hope to see you in the next one. Bye bye.